The parade ground fell silent. 200 soldiers, lined in perfect formation, stared as the colonel smirked. He had just mocked the young woman standing before him, certain she was out of her depth. His laughter echoed across the field, until, in one swift motion, she stepped forward, twisted, and the sound of bones snapping silenced him forever. No one moved. No one breathed. In that moment, the entire base realized they weren't just looking at a soldier, they were looking at something far more dangerous. The morning sun glared over the vast parade ground, its heat bouncing off the polished boots of 200 soldiers standing rigidly in formation. Their uniforms were immaculate, their rifles gleamed, and yet all discipline was tied to a single man, the colonel. He strutted across the gravel with the slow, measured steps of someone who knew he owned the ground beneath his feet. Every glance, every twitch of his jaw carried authority, and the soldiers followed him with their eyes as though he were the embodiment of the uniform itself. And then there was her. She stood alone, a single figure at the center of the field, separated from the neat lines of men. Her presence disrupted the symmetry, not because she looked weak or uncertain, but because she carried herself differently. Shoulders squared, chin high, eyes locked straight ahead. There was no fear in her posture, though the weight of hundreds of eyes pressed against her. The colonel noticed it too, and that was precisely what unsettled him. In his mind, discipline was measured by submission, and this woman had not given him any. She hadn't flinched when he barked an order. She hadn't broken when his gaze swept over her like a blade. She hadn't lowered her head in deference. To him, this was defiance. To her, it was simply strength. The soldiers had heard whispers about her arrival. Rumors that the new recruit wasn't like the others. That she had been tested elsewhere, in places where rank meant little and skill meant survival. None of them knew for sure, and gossip in a military camp always mixed fact with fantasy. Still, every man standing at attention that morning leaned ever so slightly forward, their curiosity stoked. The colonel, sensing their interest, decided this was his stage. His pride thrived on moments like these, public demonstrations where his authority could be sharpened in front of his men. He had earned his medals through service, yes, but he clung to them now as shields against any threat to his image. And what greater threat could there be than a woman who refused to bend? He circled her like a predator, boots crunching on the gravel with deliberate weight. The silence stretched thin, taut as a wire. He stopped just short of her shoulder, his voice carrying across the formation like a whip. "So this is the one," he sneered, loud enough for every soldier to hear. "The one they say can fight. The one they say doesn't need protection." He chuckled, a dry sound that rolled into laughter. "Tell me, girl, did they send you here as a soldier, or as a joke?" No one moved. Not a head turned. But in the stillness, you could feel 200 pairs of eyes widen. They expected her to break, to stammer, to falter under the colonel's voice. But she didn't. Her breathing stayed steady, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The colonel tilted his head, waiting for her to crumble. Instead, her silence pressed back against him like an invisible wall. And though he didn't admit it, not even to himself, his laughter rang just a little too loud, a little too forced, as if he were trying to fill the space where her fear should have been. The standoff had begun. The colonel's laugh carried across the parade ground like a crack of thunder. It was sharp, mocking, and laced with arrogance. Soldiers who had trained under him for years recognized the tone well. It was the sound of a man certain he held all the power. But this time, the echo of that laughter felt different. It bounced against the silence of 200 men holding their breath, waiting for something none of them could yet name. He stepped closer, his shadow cutting across her boots. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue." His words dripped with scorn, but also calculation. He wanted her to falter publicly, to be small in front of the crowd, because dominance wasn't just about strength, it was about spectacle. If he could reduce her to nothing in front of everyone, then she would never rise again. Still, she did not move. Not a blink. Not a flinch. Her silence was steady, and that steadiness stoked something ugly in him. "Do you think you belong here?" he pressed, his voice climbing. "These men," he waved his hand toward the ranks, "they've bled for their uniforms. They've carried comrades on their backs through mud and fire. And you, what have you done? What battles have you fought? What scars do you bear that make you worthy to stand among them?" The soldiers heard his words, but their eyes stayed on her. Something about her stillness unnerved them. She wasn't crumbling the way recruits normally did under the colonel's verbal assaults. Usually, voices cracked, eyes filled with tears, hands trembled. But this woman stood like a stone in the river, unmoving, unbothered. The colonel, frustrated, tried again, louder this time. "Answer me, girl. Or is silence all you have?" He jabbed a finger toward her chest, his voice rising into a sneer. "You're nothing but a liability, a distraction, a burden to every man standing here. And I'll prove it to them today." The soldiers shifted, boots scraping lightly against the gravel. Though none dared move out of line, a strange energy rippled through the formation. It wasn't just discomfort, it was anticipation. They weren't sure whether they were about to see a humiliation or a reckoning, but either way, they couldn't look away. The colonel, sensing the eyes of his men, leaned in until his face was just inches from hers. His breath was hot, his smirk curling upward as if victory were already his. "You're weak," he hissed, "and I'll break you in front of them." For the first time, she moved. Not much, just the faintest tilt of her head, enough that her eyes met his. It was a look that didn't scream defiance, but something colder, something sharper. And in that tiny moment, a shift rippled through the crowd. They couldn't name it yet, but they felt it. The colonel laughed again, louder, harsher, more desperate. He reached for her arm, intending to drag her down, to show the entire regiment just how powerless she was. And that was when the air around them seemed to tighten. Every soldier in that field leaned forward, their chests locked with the same breath. They knew instinctively, this was the moment when something was about to snap. The colonel's hand shot out like a whip, his fingers clamping around her forearm. It was meant to be a demonstration, a show of dominance in front of 200 watching soldiers. He wanted to drag her forward, to force her into submission while the regiment witnessed her collapse. His grip was iron. His smirk was cruel. He believed in that moment that he controlled her. But the truth was, his control had already slipped away. The soldiers didn't even have time to blink before it happened. With a single, precise motion, she twisted her wrist, her body pivoting into his. The movement was fluid, effortless, and yet devastatingly fast. For a heartbeat, the colonel's smirk froze in confusion, then it shattered into pain as a hand locked onto his elbow. The sound came next. A sharp, sickening crack. The silence that followed was deafening. The colonel's scream tore through the stillness as his arm bent the wrong way, his pride and flesh breaking together. His knees buckled, his once commanding frame collapsing under the weight of his own arrogance. He clutched the ruined limb, his face pale, his voice strangled by pain. And still she stood there, not panting, not smiling, not triumphant, just calm, her eyes steady as if she had done nothing more than brush a speck of dust from her sleeve. The soldiers were statues. 200 men, frozen in perfect formation, their discipline locking their bodies in place while their minds reeled. They had seen fights before. They had seen drills, sparring matches, even battlefield brutality. But this was different. This was not rage. This was not recklessness. This was control. Pure, precise control. A few of the men in the back exchanged quick glances, their expressions a mix of awe and disbelief. No one spoke. No one dared. The colonel's authority had not just been challenged, it had been broken, right there on the parade ground, in front of every witness. On the gravel, the colonel writhed, his once booming voice reduced to groans. He tried to shout, to curse her, but the words dissolved into pained gasps. His soldiers, the ones who once hung on his every order, now stood unmoving, unsure whether to rush to his aid or to remain frozen in their ranks. She didn't wait for the silence to resolve itself. Instead, she took a single step forward, her boots crunching against the gravel, and looked over the rows of men. Her gaze swept across them, steady, unyielding, and for the first time, 200 soldiers looked at her not as an intruder, not as a joke, but as someone who demanded respect without saying a word. The moment stretched long, heavy, unforgettable. It would be whispered about in barracks for weeks, retold in mess halls, carried from base to base as a legend. The day the colonel laughed, and the woman in front of him snapped not just his arm, but his hold over them all. And with that, she turned on her heel, leaving the colonel writhing in the dust while 200 soldiers stared after her, forever changed.